This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply, located in the Gem City of Dayton, Ohio. As a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network, we are happy to help you with all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs by providing the best customer service and world-class workshops. Join us January 17th to the 19th for a hands-on dual workshop with Dita Mert and Jeremy Randall. Visit cornellstudiosupply.com to sign up. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters by potters.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 530 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today I'm joined by Priscilla Dobler Dzul and Corinna Cowles. They were both residents at the Archie Bray Foundation this summer, and in this interview we talk about their experience working at the Bray as well as their current bodies of work. This year's Bray residency application deadline is December the 19th, so you can find out more and apply at archiebray.org/residencies. Before we get to that interview, I'd like to highlight a few friends of the podcast that need help recovering from the flooding due to Hurricane Helene. The Village Potters were located right there on the river in Asheville, so they are going to need some support rebuilding, and you can make a donation yourself by going to the GoFundMe campaign that is linked to the show notes in this episode. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Could each of y'all just describe where you're from and give your name so that the listener can associate your voice with your name? And let's start with you, Corinna.
I'm Corinna Cowles. I'm coming to the Bray from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I've been there for about 10 years now.
Priscilla Dobler Dzul. I'm originally from Mexico. I basically spent my time between the United States and Mexico. So half the year in one place, half the other. Based out of Washington State.
Let's talk a little bit about that switching back and forth from Mexico to the States. Are you maintaining two different studios in two different places?
Yeah, so my practice is heavy based around research, and I do a lot of research and cultivation of some of the fibers and pigments that I use in Mexico. And so a lot of my material is sourced from Mexico, and when I'm in Mexico, it's mostly field research and working with my communities. And then when I'm in the States, I have a strong just fabrication practice in my studio. So usually 6 months of research, then 6 months of heavy production.
You reference a lot of Mayan cosmology in the work. How do you make a genuine connection to a historical past that you can't necessarily touch? Like, how do you get a living, breathing sense of Mayan culture when it's thousands of years in the past?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because it's one of the questions that, and one of the concerns that I have as a contemporary Mayan mixed cultural artist. I am Mayan, Scottish, German. And so for us, it's like whenever we speak of or we reference our culture, our ancestors, people don't realize that we're still alive and we're still practicing and we're still telling the same oral stories, the same cultivation practices that were done thousands of years ago. And so for me, it's this thing where tourists come, other artists, I've seen artists come down to Mexico, especially to the Yucatan, and they are inspired by the pyramids or inspired by our codices, whatever objects that were left that weren't, destroyed. But then they don't realize that we're still present and we're still there. My artwork, I always get asked, what time era would you put this? And I'm like, what do you mean? I'm contemporary, it's current. And they're like, no, 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 you reference a lot of this. So what time era would you reference this work? And for me, I grew up in a single parent home with a Mayan mother who speaks the language, grandparents that spoke the language, aunts, and we're from a small village. So whenever we were in the capital, we would go back to the village. And these are villages where the plantations, haciendas, are strongly present. So you see the oppression, you see the struggles, you see what had occurred through colonization, which is just another element that's happening now, right? So colonization never ends. It just changes the facade. So now we're seeing these haciendas turned into romanticized wedding destinations, um, locations for medicine. For everybody wants a piece of our medicine and they want to come and experience these shamans, but they don't want to give us the respect or the acknowledge that we're still here, that we're still thriving, that those were our ancestors, but also we are still contemporary people and making work as artisans, as artists, as farmers, as however you want to see it. But yeah, it's interesting because my whole life, I grew up in these environments. I grew up listening to the language, listening to the oral stories. And it's never changed. Like as a child, I remember my grandfather telling us these oral stories, and I'm working on this big project with the Mayan women of Sututa right now, where we're doing these textiles and talking about the embroidery techniques, because everything's being lost because of capitalization and commercial. Our clothing now, like the pil that the women wear traditionally, are now being painted instead of hand embroidered. But, like the stories that they tell are stories that I listened to as a child with my grandparent. And so it's interesting that it like they continue these practices, but again, we are seen as an erased culture, an erased society, erased civilization based off of no longer living in the pyramids, no longer practicing those traditions that were practiced thousands of years ago. But again, we still have, like any other culture society, we evolve with the times for survival, right? So yeah, I think that was a really interesting question because it's one that I struggle with in regards to how I'm perceived. And I see artists come down and use our references or use our codices, but they have no connection to the communities where I was heavily heavily influenced, because I had a connection straight there, because my mother, my grandparents, cousins. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that, because that does make me realize that what I've fallen prey to is the colonial narrative versus the Mayan narrative, which is different. And I think part of the injury of colonization is often the erasure or the stealing of history. And I was looking at your work, and there were some embroidered pieces in the gallery in Germany. Is it Gnome Gallery?
Yeah, Gnome Gallery represents me in Germany.
As you were describing the work, or they were describing your work, they talked about that you had this sense that there was a specific piece about the stealing or privatization of indigenous land, and also the privatization of female bodies, or the lack of agency given to female bodies, often of artists or people of color or indigenous women specifically. So can you make that connection between land and the body, and then how you talk about that in the work?
I think one of the most interesting things that I've, I speak a lot with my elders, and I have a mentor in Mexico as well. But one of the most interesting things that I've ever learned is what we do to nature, like animals, the extinction of animals, the, extraction, the constant exploitation of land, is what we do to humans that we consider lower. And so we've always had, and we see this through colonization, and even now we see this through genocides that are occurring, is that we disregard humans based on, like, if we look at Catholicism, they had no soul, they were savages. So there was this reasoning and justification for conquer, torture, all of the things, but we always practice it first with the land and the animals. And so in Mayan culture and in many indigenous cultures, if we can no longer speak our language, we can no longer name our ancestors that are the land, that are the trees, that are the air, that are the birds, the water, the jaguars, the bears, so it's one of those that it's all connected. And so when we see the privatization of land, and after the Mexican Revolution, the land was given back to the communities throughout Mexico. In the Yucatan, there's over 400 plantations. If you think about how many plantations that is, 401 peninsula of 3 states, I mean, that is massive. Like we are known as docile because we have this long history of slavery, of, rape, genocide. And so we see how women are treated. We see the disregard for women, and we see the disregard, the stripping of man's power and rights. Like we don't really discuss that, but there is a lot of trauma in men as well, and especially indigenous communities. And so you constantly see this. You see the extraction, the labor. You go to villages in Oaxaca, the Yucatan, Chiapas, all of these other places in Mexico, and you see the exploitation of artists coming in and like, oh, we want to work with this artisan, we'll pay you this much. And then they leave, and then they make double or pay or whatever it is that they gains the profits. We see it with designers, like all of these different methods. And so for me, it's one of those where it's just this constant. We're watching as the trade Maya is just literally destroying the whole entire jungle, which the Mayan rainforest is just as important as the Amazon rainforest. And nobody addresses that nor talks about it. And a lot of it is based because of the globalization and the connection between America and Mexico, right? So the United States and Mexico have a huge trade. Europe is, their investments are the ones that are building these train tracks, especially Germany, France, and Spain. And so again, we see this disregard of land, and we see the disregard of people. We see the disregard of women disappearing. Women, this whole increase of violence towards women is the same way we treat the land. And if people can associate that and see how it's been done in the United States throughout the history of the Native Americans in the United States, it's all similar throughout the Americas, from the very tip of the north all the way to the south. And so for me, it's something that you constantly see and you understand, the way your body is sexualized, the way your body is just regarded as a piece of something. The same, it's how we oh, this property, this land is beautiful. We want to take it and conquer. It's that same association. And, through my research and my study is the negotiations of culture are based around food, and also based around, okay, so the noble princesses, noble families would marry Spanish colonizers so that they could still retain their land and retain their rights. And so this is where okay, again, this association of how women's bodies have been used as negotiations of power, but also how ceramic, earthenware, and televera has been used as a negotiation of power through customs of changing dialogues and using food, right? So for the Spanish to be able to conquer, they also had to have a relationship with the Aztec, with the indigenous cultures, because they needed to have connections in, and they needed to marry into these wealthy, noble families. Because prior to them arriving, we already had a class structure, we had hierarchies, we had all of these systems that were erased. And again, who gets to write history, right? So the winners always write the history and what is being told. But it's something that we see consistently, the number of violence, the militarization of this train Maya, and the violence increasing towards women and the land is, it's pretty shocking. It's how do you prevent this or stop this? And it's, again, like I said, colonization never ended. It just takes another facade. It just takes another face, because it's morphing and modifying the way it wants to conquer and how it wants to show that no, we're not doing anything here. And so that's for me, where I put those two.
Yeah, and I think there's a sense, or at least in the capitalist narrative, is oh, this is progress. We're going to make this train. We're going to bring all these tourists faster to the tourist sites. So that's progress, because then that's more dollars that are being brought into Mexico. But it is a complete disregard of ecosystems, and people, So It's good to see your work address that, and a lot of it is the embroidery work. Like that was the work that I was looking at, and it made me just think about cloth in general. And that we'll come back to your sourcing and the dyes you're using because I think that's really interesting. But Corinna, I wanted to ask you about cloth as well because I noticed. I think actually your training you'd said was as a painter, but you've done paint, you do clay, you've done like textile, you've kind of done it all. So how does the 2D work inform the 3D work?
Yeah, my background's in painting, but I feel like I've always been like an in-betweener, like painter, sculptor, but I definitely like identify as a painter. I feel like, I'm really interested in textiles we choose for our home, textiles we choose to put on our bodies. I love the materiality of fiber and being able to stuff it, to soak it, to dye it. Like there's so much you can do to play, to cut and tear. Um, and so I kind of approach clay with that same kind of attitude. Like for me, clay is similar to fiber because I will do a lot of dyeing with pigments in my buckets, just like I would be dyeing my fabrics for my paintings. And I've always kind of worked unstretched, and things really have like a loose flow to them. Being able to kind of like open paintings up or fold them back together. And with the ceramics too, I think a lot about things being able to be installed in different iterations and always changing. And that's like really exciting to me. Is it on the floor? Is it on the wall? Just having that kind of flexibility is really fun and playful. And I like too to think about like color being on the surface of a material, but also being in the material. And so that's another like similarity between working with the textiles and also clay, right? You can dye it, but you can paint on it, you can carve it.
Hearing you talk about this explains the clay work because when I was researching you, I was thinking, is this all the same person's work? Because you approach pattern, but like sometimes there's applique, sometimes it's 3D coiled, sometimes it's painted on or carved in, as you said. Like it seems like there's no boundaries of technique in terms of what you're using to then make the work. How does that work in your studio? Do you tend to like, let's say, make a series of pots that are all carved for the technique, and then make a series that are like the colored laid on coils, or do you all work at the same time? Like, how does it work in the studio flow?
Yeah, it's kinda all happening at the same time, and I'm just kind of like it's almost like this dance between me and the work, and I'm just kind of reacting to the material, but I usually have several pieces going at once, so I'll kind of bounce around between techniques, and I love seeing it all together. I feel like my work really complements they complement each other, and so being able to work in this way where I am bouncing back and forth is really exciting to me. It's just like the studio feels like my laboratory, and it's like nothing is off limits. And so that really keeps me excited and engaged. And there's challenges, of course, to like solving the composition or like figuring out the next move. But it really does feel like this fun collaboration just with like material and just like figuring it out.
Yeah, there's that excitement also. I feel like when you're figuring something out and you're like, is this going to fail? Like you're like kind of riding that edge of like, this is a new process or a new technique. It means that you have skin in the game. Like actively engaged, which the Bray is great for that. Especially y'all are working in the summer studio where you can see through and see what everyone's doing. How have y'all been able to kind of feed off of that collective energy of the whole there at the Bray this summer?
Well, I know for me, like I'm a workaholic. Like I love being at the studio from like 9 to 5, maybe later. But just like being in that space with energy of other people, like Priscilla, it's grinding in the morning, it was like the last one to leave yesterday. So it's just really nice to kind of feed off of that energy and be in the zone, but then also like take breaks and like I can hear what Priscilla's working on when she's like blowing into her pots, and it's just like really exciting to have that space activated by other makers.
I love coming in. Like Corinna and Carrie are usually in there in the mornings as well. But like the color choices Corinna uses, and the shapes, I always stop by for a little bit. I'm like, oh my gosh, that looks really great. Oh my gosh, that, I'm really drawn. I think there's this beauty of and seduction that color does. And the color has a long history as well. And so yeah, I'm always drawn by that because I usually work in a lot of bright colors, but lately I've been just toning everything down. So I'm always inspired when I see colors. One of the big things for me is I'm drawn to that. And then Kim does these, like Kim's studio is right next to me, and I love seeing these big forms, and she works so fast where I'm such a slow worker. And I'm building whistles, I'm building all these things that are going into these pots, and she's just like building like this insane, and they're huge, right? I'm like building so small compared. So yeah, it's amazing to see. I'm not a true ceramicist, but it's amazing to see how quickly and how much knowledge everybody seems to have and skill. It's just one of those. It's where like you're like, wow, every single one of these artists really has mastered their technique and their craft. And to be able to be in a space like the Bray and have those resources, but also artists that are like highly craft and highly artistic and contemporaries is really inspiring, and it pushes you to want to work harder too on your own work.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
The Bray Clay business is your best source for Bray epoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Bray epoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. Order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
Priscilla, I wanted to talk about a show that you had, Future Cosmologies, which was at Mad Art in Seattle. I think that was 2023. You had neon, you had ceramics, you had, I think there's fiber in that, and somewhere there's also live plants. So there's like some timing of all of this beyond the visual, like that there's just so much going on visually. How do you think about, for an exhibition, like how did you get live plants in there at the right time? Like this, there was a certain risk of trying to pull this all together. So can you talk a little bit just about that show and about the ideas and also the plants?
In Washington State, we only have a short frame for farming, right? Cultivating, and it's the summertime because during the winter, it's pretty hard. The show was in the fall. Installation started in September, so it was great timing for the germination of the seeds. But really what happened was the idea and the process came from I'm fascinated. I carry seeds in Mayan culture. There's seed exchanges are very important, especially throughout the Yucatan. There's different communities that come together. My collaborative partner, Daniela, who runs Cultiva in Sotuta, she also hosts giant gatherings where at the end of the cultivation season, they bring in seeds from different regions so that we can do an exchange. And so for me I was walking my dog and like 2 summers ago, so 2021 and summer 2021, and she kept sniffing at these germinated pods of like seeds that, and the forms were, Washington State, I'm so fortunate in the places that I live because there's so much green space and there's so much diversity in what grows in these regions, as Mexico, where I'm from, or in Washington State. And so there was like all of these seeds as we're walking, and I'm starting to collect them as she stops to sniff. And that's why I said there's this beauty and this appreciation when I speak to my elders of how we should respect all living forms of life. And the fact that my dog led me to this project, like this this idea of my dog paying attention to the most smallest insignificant thing for most of us, but in all reality, it's the most important thing for the future. And so these germinated pods had all these geometric forms and designs and shapes. And as they open, they literally look like space capsules, right? So boom, boom, boom. And they're all these just different organic shapes. But then when they're open, it's just this abstract, broken down seed. And so I started collecting all of these. And then in summer of 2022, I had a sculpture. I usually only work in clay during the summer in Washington because I like to work outdoors in the elements. So I don't have a damp room. I don't have access to any kilns or anything. So for me to be able to roll clay with rollers and work out in the sun and allow the sun to dry things for me so I can work at a faster pace is perfect. But I had a piece that broke and I threw it to a corner and I threw some seeds on it, just some native flower seeds. And it sprouted like just crazy, just grew. And the sculpture looks so much more interesting. And so when I was nominated for Mad Art to do this application, there was only, I think there was 13 of us, or sorry, 16 of us that were nominated for this opportunity. I was in Mexico and I was working with fungi and going up to the mountainsides to collect fungi to be able to dye. And so I was just like, how important for the future, for our future ancestors right now. Again, it comes back to this history and relationship that I've had with the art world, where my work is always disregarded as something of the past without realizing that we're contemporary Mayan artists that are currently living. A lot of us are mixed cultural, like we come from, multiple cultures. And so for me, it was just like, okay, so how do we push forward? And if a lot of us are doing all of the healing work that we can right now to heal the generational trauma and pains that our families carry, like how can I push that so it's creating a healing space for our future to know, future ancestors to know, but also relating and going back to the cosmologies and how important those are to our understanding, right? So I guess, and nowadays everybody's obsessed with the zodiacs and what's your horoscope, but there's so much more than just the basic ones that we know. I mean, I was like doing research on the cosmologies and all of these different, even in Greek, Rome, and like there's just so much more cosmologies and representations and stars that we just like don't even talk about. And so I was looking at the Mayan ones, and again, it's unfortunate because a lot of our codices, out of the thousands of codices that were burnt, there's only 4 that exist, and 3 of the major ones are in Europe, and the most restored and preserved are in Europe, and there's one in Mexico City. I don't have access to go to Europe. Like I want to go so badly. I want to be able. So there's one in Spain, in Madrid, one in Paris, and then the other one is in Germany. I don't remember which one, and they're all named off of these European cities when it's like, like it. So it's just, again, interesting. It's like because they discovered it or whatever it is, or they found it. And so my training is in woodworking, sculpture, and textiles. I grew up, my family has a history of weaving and embroidery. So I learned from my aunties, my grandma. So I didn't do any formal training. It's just basically what I've been taught through family. And I wanted to come back and figure a way, how can I germinate and grow these in these spaces that it's already very damp. It's our rain season, going into our rain season. And so the only way I could think about it is creating and mimicking these shapes and designs of these pods, and then inputting LED lights to allow for the growth. And then in the overhead of the post of the structure of the gallery space, having plant lights, to be able to grow. And, there's different processes of germination. So having to have the right heat, had heating lamps placed on the structures as well. And then basically creating these deities or these gods that I wanted to be representation of, like to be able to protect our histories and push it forward so it can continue to flourish and grow. And in that installation, I used animal pelts that were roadkill. My good friend Katie is a taxidermist, so she was able to provide me with roadkill pelts that she collected throughout the years. And I met her in grad school, and I used to talk to her and collect or point out where we would find roadkill throughout upstate New York. And then on those, I embroidered the cosmologies and maps of how to read the directions of like how to find the cosmologies, but then also our stories of creation and how life was created for us, and the representation of other animals like the crocodile, whose back is representational of the Milky Way, and the relationships that we have with crocodiles. So I was just trying to incorporate all of that. And then I brought in my grandmother's ipiles, her traditional clothing, as a representation of like the everyday woman of the Yucatan who wears these, like the mestizas, what they're called, because these clothings prior to colonization were methods of distinguishing where you're from, who your family was, depending on the embroidery and the technique, and also your class system. And then after colonization, it became a thing that were basically, it was switched around in like the terminology that was used. A mestiza, someone that's mixed race. And so like it switched around and what class you had above the Indian blood, if you're full Indian blooded. And then there's other garments that are just more elaborate and more beautiful. But again, a lot of the native women wouldn't be able to wear those based on class structures that were created after colonization. And so just trying to bring in all of those elements to create. And then there was rope that I had dyed with indigo, and the rope that I'm using are the plants that were used during the gold era, which is the plantations were created for the anaken, which is the shipping thread of that was used, the rope. And so dyeing that and talking about the relationship we had to that plant prior to colonization, and then creating a rain piece, and in the center where it was a ceramic sculpture of the rain god Cha, and then audio of thunder, lightning, and birds, and then being able to walk around. But I created it in a way that it looks more like a dance, because it's a dance to the rain gods. My elderly uncle, who's a farmer, was telling me it no longer rains like it used to. And so their crops can no longer grow. Again, it was all related to the histories and relationships we've had with this ecosystem and the outer space, the cosmologies that have influenced a lot of the work in the past and in the future.
Yeah, and it makes me think about specificity, because in that show, some of the things become really abstract. Like even the plants growing with the lights around them, like it's visually interesting, but it's abstract in the way you look at it. But it's concrete, like it's a growing organism, and you said like those were things that you found with your dog. So this is like, there's a personal narrative there. But then there's other symbols in your work that are really concrete, like the jaguar. Like that's something that in the Mayan cosmology is really important, but it's also to us, like we know that. We know, okay, that's a jaguar. Like that's not abstract. And I was thinking about that too with your work, Corinna. Like sometimes you use elements where you can tell like that's a flower. But then at other times your work is really more just completely abstract, and it's about color, and it seems like it's maybe about emotion. So can y'all both kind of talk about how you think about specificity in the references you use, or abstraction as a whole in your bigger bodies of work?
I think for me, there are times where I want to be really direct, and so I will use specific symbols or like references from the world, whether they're quilt patterns or textile patterns, or my flower designs or my cutouts. And a lot of times like those are, at least with the cutouts, like directly pulled from my work on paper. So there is some other kind of like specific reference, or like I've already worked with this shape before and I'm just like bringing it into clay. And like sometimes I'll use text, but that can be really personal and kind of tricky. So in other work, I'll like try and abstract things, and there is a lot of like emotion or things that are like maybe meant for me to know, where things get a little looser. And that's kind of like where loops will come in, and I'll just kind of like abstract text in this like kind of feminine way where it's like maybe it could have been cursive, but now it's just line work. But I really like to go back and forth between those things, because I think it can be hard to get into the personal sometimes. And so for me, it's kind of a way to like teeter in this space of like, what do I want to reveal or conceal
I wanted to ask Corinna though, like, cause it's been really interesting watching her process. Just like your shapes keep changing and what inspires the shapes? Cause it always seems like there's something new and they're not similar. So how does that keep morphing? Like the evolution of like one shape that then I saw all of a sudden had like a bigger, bigger, longer, taller, and then like more of those like I don't know, those circular forms around it. So I was just wondering like how do you keep changing and know like which type of form or shape you want to push?
Yeah, I work a lot in like with paper and collage, and so I was using these shapes that I would use in paper, and one of my favorite parts about cutting things apart is the offcuts and the scraps, and so I always feel like I'll have like, you know, the piece that I really wanted that shape, but then I get really excited about, the edge of it, and so I will incorporate both aspects of those shapes, and then also, one of my favorite things to do is, like, scale shifts and really, like, blowing things up and minimizing things or, playing with asymmetry and flipping it and rotating it, and so I feel like for me, it's always just kind of, like, reacting to the form that I've built and being like, "This needs a handle, it needs this arm," and then pulling from my pile of cutouts or, just creating a new one and seeing what fits and what doesn't fit. So, but it's really just kind of like this intuitive, kind of quick process when I'm actually doing it. But I love cutting stuff apart and seeing how it can be rearranged or changed and altered, and it's just endless. And I find so much joy in just playing with shapes.
I'm glad you asked that question. This makes me think about the idea of iterative change, where like A kind of looks like B and C kind of looks like B, versus sometimes change or a new body of work, it's like A and then J and then Z. Like it's almost like the artist is changing so fast that you can't figure out how they get from A to B or whatever. So for me as the interviewer, the researcher, I'm often trying to figure that out. Like, how did you make the connection between this and that? So I wonder how y'all think about being at the Bray. Has it allowed y'all to take some like big swings and really change the work? Or has it been more kind of baby steps in the progression of the work this summer?
For me, it definitely feels like I have a lot of freedom here in terms of scale, but also just I'm like, what's the worst that can happen? Like, I don't feel like there's this preciousness. Like, I don't know if I need to fire everything or um, just doing and making and being in it has just been so great and important. And I even feel like I've kind of been trying to follow what I had proposed, but I'm kind of off in this other world right now. And I'm really excited to like continue making these funny, humorous, like Corinna versions of household objects. And so just kind of being able to play and have freedom in the studio has kind of led me down this other path that just feels really exciting. And I don't know if I would have gotten there without being here and being around to everyone else and seeing their work and just feeling like, I can do anything here.
Yeah, same here. I haven't even started what I proposed for the residency. I think for me right now, I've just been really focusing on expanding on these vessels that are modified and built for my body and to be held for performances. So this space right now, the Bray right now is providing me again, just with the like, I don't have access to kilns. Like for me to get to a kiln, I have to drive 45 minutes to an hour just to get them fired. And we all know the process of taking bone dry clay on a highway just to get to another city to get things fired. Um, so I kind of feel like Karina was saying, like a little bit of this freedom that you can do whatever you want because you have access to so much that it for me, it can be a little overwhelming. But I am hoping in the next week or two to be able to start building some of the stuff that I had proposed so that I can experiment with the soda firing. I've been wanting to try that. And then also I've spoken with Sunshine and Rebecca and being able to fire some things to be at a bisque so that I can come back and do some wood firing um, when the season allows it. Again, just looking at different techniques of firing and seeing what I like is what I really wanted to experiment with. But yeah, right now I feel like I have the freedom and the time to make work that's important to me.
I like that y'all brought up that you kind of propose one idea, and then when you get there, you just make what you're going to make. I think that's kind of the beauty of the Bray is that it allows you. I think the administration, like, they want to know you have a plan, but it's totally okay if you abandon your plan, as long as you finish on time. I don't know if they talked about that yet, but you definitely got to finish on time and then get all the stuff out of there. But besides that, it is a really freeing environment, which I think as artists or just me personally, like sometimes borders and boundaries are good for me and sometimes they just piss me off. And the Bray has been really good at like figuring that out. Like how much structure do you need? What structure is too much? So how have y'all experienced the structure of the Bray itself? Like have you felt contained by it in a positive or a negative way?
I feel like it's nice because you can just clock your hours. Like it's really nice to just be on your schedule. We have the weekly meeting, so there is a little bit of structure. But just being able to come in and go when you want has been really good for me. I feel like the lack of, there's responsibilities like as a resident and with your community, but just the emphasis on work and like this is your time is a really amazing aspect of being here. I don't feel like spread super thin. It's like I really am able to be in the zone and do the work that I came here to do.
Yeah, and for me, I feel the same way that Corinna was just describing. Like there is structure. We have our weekly meetings. We have a obligation to our community as well to upkeep, the studio space, make sure everything is clean so that anybody who's going to use because we're all working with different clays, right? So the clay that I'm using, I'm like, I think I'm the only one using this highly rich iron red clay, and everybody is using these beautiful white clays, and so it stains. My whole entire space is stained, right? Um, so just being aware of the space that you take, so that you're leaving it clean as well, whatever equipment you're using. But for me, I love being able to have the freedom, and I was having a conversation with Rebecca, and like I'm describing, last year was very tenseful. A lot of the protest and activism work that I was doing in the Yucatan really takes a toll on your body when you have a lot of anxiety. And I had to produce quite a bit I had so many shows last year, and even the show that I was doing for Mad Art, there's so many sculptures in there, multiple sculptures, and then different mediums, so it does take a toll on the body. And I had to produce a lot of textiles. And so when Rebecca and I were talking, and it's really amazing and it's encouraging when you have support from community and members that are part of the Bray, right? That are like making sure that are like part of the jury committee, but also aware and being able to say, hey, look, sometimes the reason you're at the Bray is to allow the body to heal too, right? So to allow the body to heal, like so many of us carry a lot, and a lot of work that we do is so much activism. So the body needs time to heal and work at a pace where it can still work, but it can also produce what it needs to so that it can heal. And so it was amazing to have that conversation with Rebecca, and for her to understand, like, even though I'm, doing 12 hours a day, I feel like I'm still working slower than usual. And she's like, it's okay. The body has to heal sometimes.
To wrap up, could y'all leave either your website or social media, whatever you feel comfortable with, so that people could get in touch if they wanted to talk about any of this?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram. It's just Corinna Cowles Clay. And I also have my website, just CorinnaCowles.com, where I'll update with new work. And I also will do some small like shop updates of my tableware and smaller vessels if you want to check it out.
The best way to reach me is like either reaching out to the institutions or my galleries.
Well, thank y'all so much. This has been a real pleasure. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And
Thanks.
I appreciate the questions too.
I'd like to thank Priscilla and Corinna for coming on the show and wish them well as they have gone off to continue their work away from the Bray. The summer residency is the way that I got to know the Bray. I was a summer resident in 2013, and it was a life-changing experience. If you would like to be a resident, either summer or long-term, or visiting artist, you can find out more by visiting the website. That's archiebray.org/residencies. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and the Archie Bray. If you or your organization would like to be a sponsor on our show, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.